The Blood Dragon, a beast born from the blood of the murdered. Able to transform any mob into his mindless servant, he hunts the overworld, hungry to avenge the fallen. Once a normal dragon, his home was being attacked by the Dragon Slayer and his men. Forced to watch his parents' sudden murders, he reeled back in shock. Falling into a blood-filled lake, the dragon sank deeper as the blood soaked into his skin. Twisting around in pain, his body grew in size as the suffering of every dragon fused into his very soul, transforming him into the horrific Blood Dragon. He was hit with intense sadness, then unimaginable rage as he relived each of their deaths. Suddenly flying out of the deep red liquid, he composed himself as his new reality sank in. How would he ever survive in a world without his parents? How could someone do that to them? Just then, a wandering trader walked into view, unable to process his trauma, and seeing these new creatures triggered the beast's rage. Losing all control, he began violently shooting blood from his mouth. Caught in the blast, the trader's llamas were transformed into undead creatures and turned on their horrified trader. The dragon became overwhelmed and flew away. However, he was exhausted and soon fell from the skies, crashing into a village below. Again, blood flew out of his mouth as he struggled with his grief. Flooding the streets of the town, villagers were swept away in waves of red, crying as the blood flooded their throats. Regaining control of himself, the Blood Dragon looked at the destruction around him as the shambling corpses of bloody villagers suddenly revealed themselves. Immediately, these bloody villagers began swarming and tearing everything apart. After watching these cursed villagers, the dragon flew off, conflicted. He had destroyed these villages and their home. Was he any different than the Dragon Slayer? What did it matter? If he couldn't have the life he wanted, then why should they? He was going to make them all pay for his suffering. The dragon searched for days, hunting for any signs of players. Every base he came across would be quickly decimated and flooded with blood. His blood, however, did not affect these players in the same way as other mobs. When a player touched it, they found themselves shaking uncontrollably before exploding into a mist of red. One night, after terrorizing a base, the dragon stopped to rest in a clearing. Growing thirsty, the dragon made his way to a nearby river, but in drinking, he thought that it tasted strange before realizing this water was filled with blood. It was then that something caught his eye. A dragon skeleton was resting on the surface of the water. Then he noticed another under a tree, and another, and another. He was in a dragon graveyard. Immediately, he had a bloody vision. He watched in horror as each dragon in the clearing was slain by the same slayer and his forces. Their screams rang through his mind. The experience was so overwhelming that he reeled back and screamed out himself. Just then, an arrow struck him. Shocked, he quickly turned around, only to be met with a group of players. They were all dressed exactly the same as the ones from his vision. Roaring out, he immediately breathed his bloody breath on them. However, they jumped out of the way, and the blood ended up hitting a herd of cows instead. The dragon tried again to breathe blood, but nothing came out. He then noticed an intense pain from where the arrow had struck him. Players had hit him with a special arrow of weakness, and he was losing strength by the second. Determined to avenge his family, the Blood Dragon tried to bite at the players, only to be shot with even more arrows. Immediately, the dragon fell to the ground and slipped into unconsciousness. When the Blood Dragon awoke, he found himself trapped in a reinforced glass box with the Slayer standing before him. Having never seen a dragon like this before, the Slayer seemed confused, yet curious. Just then, one of the other men walked up to him and whispered something in his ear.
Did it really? Well, we'll have to run some tests then.
Approaching two of his scientists, the Slayer instructed them to study the beast before leaving the room. Over the coming days, the Blood Dragon was subjected to numerous experiments. They would hit him with various potions, subject him to extreme heat, and drop other mobs into his cell. Filled with pain and rage, the dragon was once again hit with blood visions, this time from the dragons who had died to the Slayer's experiments. He saw them suffering over and over again. Tormented, he would lash out in his cell, and eventually the Slayer's men managed to get a bucket of blood from him during one of these outbursts. Testing its properties, they poured some on a creeper and were able to transform it into a blood creeper. Finally, this is what they had been after. The Dragon Slayer was called back into the lab and was pleased to see the progress his men had made.
Perfect. If We can harness this power. We can use it to finish the last of these dreadful dragons.
The dragon was horrified. They were going to use his blood to kill the last of his kind? Furious, he roared out, startling the players. One of them accidentally dropped the bucket of blood, spilling it all over the floor and a scientist. Running towards the other for help, he exploded right in front of him, covering the second scientist in his blood, as the blood soaked into his skin too.
Subscribe to Dr. Bonks! Subscribe to Dr. Bonks!
The player watched in horror before he too was met with the same fate. This dragon's blood was clearly too dangerous to mess with, so the Slayer decided that he would need to kill this dragon now. Pulling a lever, the dragon's tank began to fill up with water, but then the tank started turning red, and the liquid so thick that the Slayer could no longer see inside of it. He quickly left, deciding that he would just send his men to dump this body with the rest. However, when the men arrived, they were met with the sounds of cracking glass. Suddenly, the glass of the cage shattered, and blood came pouring out. Unable to react in time, all of the men were hit by the wave of blood, bursting as the dragon broke free. Smashing out of the lab, the blood dragon looked around for the Slayer, but he was nowhere to be found. If he couldn't kill this Slayer, how would he ever stop his visions? Re-entering the lab for a lead, he noticed a witch locked inside one of the cells. The dragon knew enough about witches to know that they dealt in magic. She could free him from these horrible nightmares. Breaking the witch out of her prison, the blood dragon demanded that she ease his torment. The witch explained that she had no idea how to. She only dabbled in small potions. The dragon devoured the witch in an instant. He was growing more impatient by the day. He didn't have time for excuses. Flying off into the night, the dragon decided to hunt for more witches. Surely one of them could fix his broken mind. As the days passed, more and more witches were found, but each one said the same thing. They had no idea what to do and quickly found themselves on the wrong end of the blood dragon's jaws. The beast was finding it impossible to rest, only growing more tired and more furious as he continued for days in search of a witch to help him. He had almost given up all hope when he stumbled upon a witch hut bigger than any he'd ever seen before. Landing in front, he roared out, and as the witch revealed herself, he could tell that she was different from the others. The blood dragon growled, and looking him over, the witch immediately understood.
Ah, so you've been cursed by the blood, have you? And you wish to be cured?
The dragon nodded. She explained that she could help him, but there was one ingredient that was missing for her antidote. They would have to retrieve it first. The dragon was overjoyed to hear that a cure was possible, and grateful that a witch was finally willing to help him. She knew much about the blood curse, and offered him a temporary solution.
If you drink this potion, it will help your spirit rest for the night.
Quickly drinking it down, the dragon drifted off to sleep. The next night, the dragon awoke, feeling better than he could ever remember. Finally, he was able to think clearly again. Thanking the witch, she brushed it off and reminded him that she still needed the ingredient for the cure. Understanding, the dragon motioned for her to get on his back, and they flew off together. While they soared the skies, the witch and dragon bonded. Able to read the dragon's trauma through his scales, she empathized with him, explaining that she too had lost her parents to a horrible tragedy. They had been burned at the stake by some angry villagers when she was just a child. Feeling understood for the first time in ages, the dragon growled out in gratitude. They eventually arrived at the peak of a massive mountain and were met with a large cave opening. Entering inside, the two found a strange black rose. It seemed to give off a dreadful aura. The dragon didn't like it, but knew that he needed that cure more than anything. Picking the flower, the witch stashed it away before hopping back on the blood dragon. When they got back to the hut, the witch then got to work mixing the potion. Eventually, it was finished, and she walked out holding a special bottle. Lifting it up to the dragon's lips, he began to drink. However, instead of feeling better, he was beginning to feel worse. Coughing violently, the dragon reeled back at its bitter taste. The witch laughed out.
Foolish dragon! Your poison blood will make my potions 10 times stronger than ever!
This witch had never wanted to cure him. She only wanted to use him. Furiously, he thrashed about. Scared, she quickly threw a potion of weakness at the dragon, but it was no use. Weak and poisoned as he was, he had enough strength left to blast the witch with his breath. She screamed out, as she was transformed into a bloody witch and lost all control of her body. As the dragon felt his life slipping away, he was drawn to the witch's blood. Struggling, the dragon crawled into the hut and noticed a potion in an item frame. Smashing the potion, he began to feel his life returning, along with his anger. This witch had just proven there was no one he could trust. Viewing the world as a lost cause, the dragon began spreading his bloody curse everywhere. He was going to find the Dragon Slayer, no matter the cost. Villages especially became easy targets for their high populations of infectable mobs. And as time progressed, the dragon eventually had an army of blood villagers. These villagers would follow the dragon's every command, leaving their homes abandoned and rotting to this day. Spreading out, they would overtake the world. Player bases were destroyed, more villages were turned, and pillager outposts were left in ruin. Every player and mob quickly learned to fear the blood dragon and his army. Their influence became so great that eventually both players and pillagers decided they had to work together if they wanted to survive. Leading the efforts against this beast was the Dragon Slayer. He knew this monster better than anyone, and he was going to be the one to take him down. Bloody battles between the opposing forces would continue for months. While fighting, pillagers discovered a way to use the dragon's blood against him and created the first totems of Undying. This seemed to give the players and pillagers an advantage in the fight, but it was short-lived. As the number of infected villagers continued to grow, their numbers overwhelmed anything in their path. It didn't matter how many totems they had, any opposing force would be crushed, and eventually a horde of bloody villagers discovered the Slayer's headquarters. Screaming out, the blood dragon flew above the Slayer's fortress. It was time. The Dragon Slayer came forward, wielding his special blade. Flying directly at the player, the two clashed back and forth before charging at each other and colliding in an explosion of blood.